In this lecture, I speak about the composer Friedrich Cerha. Friedrich Cerha is a very special case. His repertoire, in sheer number of pieces and in variety of styles and genres, exceeds all the other composers of my lecture series. I even dare to say it would exceed most other composers I know of. There are so many different things he did in his life. So, to approach Cerha best, I came up with a structure I now quickly sum up. So I will start with a historical and personal background. That's the first chapter. Then I will go to a chapter I would call Alternative Serial Tendencies and Post-Serial Strategies. Then I would move on to a topic I call Folklore, folk music influences, and unexpected things in his music and in his work. And then the last chapter will focus on his music theater works. So let's begin with the first chapter, the historical and personal background of Cerha and his music. I usually avoid talking too much about biographical things when talking about a composer. I rather try to focus on the music and the context around certain pieces. But in Cerha's case, a look at his life is helpful and also extremely interesting. Looking at his life can be seen almost as a lesson in European music history. First of all, Friedrich Cerha is still alive today and he is in good health. He is now 94 years old. Friedrich Cerha was born in Vienna in 1926. Please be aware of these years. In terms of music, it was the time of the Second Viennese School. There were also composers like Zemlinsky, Schreker, Hindemith, Janacek, Gershwin, Bartók. Bartók's Miraculous Mandarin and Puccini's Turandot, for example, have been premiered in this year. But it was also the time the Nazis rose to power in Germany and Austria. And it was the time when Hitler was already giving speeches. His musical education began in the 1930s. In the 1940s, he had to join the war. He also was engaged in active resistance against the Nazis in this time, and twice he deserted from the army. He then hid in the Austrian mountains until the end of the war. His war experience and the time in the mountains will also influence his music later, especially one of his major works called Spiegel, in German this means mirror. It's a huge orchestral cycle of 7 pieces. We'll talk about this piece later. After the war, he continued to study composition, German literature, and philosophy in Vienna. He tried to find out as much as possible about the music, what has been created outside of the cultural Nazi borders, and attended concerts of the 4 armies that occupied Vienna at this time: the Soviets, the French, the British, and the American. Each of them gave concerts with their own music, present their most popular and famous composers. He also became acquainted then with a newly formed avant-garde in Vienna. He was close to the painters and poets of this time. These relationships will also become part of his music later. The music scene in Austria and Germany of this time was actually dominated a lot by Neoclassicism, following ideas and pieces by Hindemith or Stravinsky, for example. Cerha then found contact to the Schönberg Cycle, or the remains of the Schönberg Cycle, who remained in Vienna. He was also able to go to Darmstadt courses to meet new composers and ideas, of course, especially serialism. We're talking about the 1950s now. But he would take these ideas in a less dogmatic way. He would take serialism, but he would always keep his bond to Webern, who, in all the structuring and condensation, always kept his bond to the tradition. So Cerha would also always keep his bond, his link to the tradition. In the future, he would use serial ideas and integrate them into his own conceptual and aesthetic world. Always also have a breathing musical flow, so also a more open interpretation of tempi and a more open search for emotional expression in the music. That actually goes for his own music, but also for his work as conductor. Again, for example, for the Webern pieces he conducted. He would conduct it definitely different than Boulez would do in the 1950s. But also I have to say that Boulez later changed his style of conducting a little bit, and also his approach on Webern. His later recordings are often much slower than what he did in the 50s. In those years, also Ligeti came to Vienna. So after these impressions they found in Darmstadt, he founded together with George Ligeti and Kurt Schwerzig, another composer, the ensemble Die Reihe, means like the row, like in 12-tone row. And also was the name of a magazine which was published by the music publishing house Universal Edition in Vienna, and which was a main voice for serial music and music following Schoenberg ideas. Die Reihe, the row, became one of the first ensembles dedicated to contemporary music. They would play music of the second Viennese school and the music of their time. Over many, many decades they existed. So remember, it's the 1950s, so they play Luciano Berio, Bruno Maderna, and also John Cage. So some of their concerts were scandals, in good tradition of the Schoenberg tradition actually, who also caused some scandals. Scandal mean that there would be people who try to disturb the concert, making noises or protest against the concerts. But also many people appreciated what they have been doing. It's also the time when Pierre Boulez, Luigi Nono and Stockhausen started to become famous. Stockhausen and Boulez are also the same generation. So Cerha was born in 1926. Stockhausen was born in 1928. Nono was born in 1924. Boulez was born in 1925 and Ligeti was born in 1923. So in the 50s, serialism was introduced as a major idea that would shape the music for quite a while, also because of what grew out of serialism. In one of my other lectures, I showed that serialistic ideas are actually present today, still in many, many schools, and then of course in many schools after serialism. I also heard this ensemble, Die Reihe, many times play in Vienna. Unfortunately, last year the ensemble was dissolved and stopped over after 60 years of playing. But now there are a lot of new ensembles, so they somehow gave their torch to the now following generation, and their work somehow is continued. Friedrich Cerha is also known for completing Alban Berg's opera Lulu. So Berg died in 1935, way too early because of blood poisoning, and was not able to finish his opera. But there were sketches and material left, and 390 bars have been already also orchestrated by Berg. And there were the first 2 acts, so there was a model on how it could be done. Alban Berg's widow, Helene Berg, first asked Arnold Schoenberg to finish the piece, but he declined for complex reasons. So she forbid that any other composer would be allowed to finish the piece. So Cerha did this work of finishing the piece in secret, and it was first performed in Cerha's version after the death of Helene Berg, the widow of Alban Berg. Pierre Boulez was the conductor. Today it can be performed either in this version or in the version of Alban Berg without the final parts. For musicologists or composers, this is a very interesting research object. If you're interested, take a look into this piece, what Cerha finished. Cerha also wrote a very detailed report where he explained why and what he did. I also heard a new version made by Eberhard Kloke, a German conductor, which sometimes chooses different approach on the piece, also super interesting, I think, for research. In the orchestral music of Friedrich Cerha, you may be able to hear the language of Berg once in a while. Also in general, Cerha has a close musical relationship to the Second Viennese School, of course. I may even would dare to call him an heir or a form of continuation of the Second Viennese School in a very, very unique and own way. But also this own way would be a very specific thing for the Second Viennese School, I think. Also interestingly, he was a student of Joseph Matthias Hauer. In case you never heard the name, please do some research, it's very interesting. He was a composer who, parallel to Schoenberg, had his own theory and technique for the composition with all the 12 tones. He also lived in Vienna. But he did not found as much attention as Schoenberg, and also his approach was very different, let's say it like this. But it's also very interesting music. So I very recommend to have a look at him, Joseph Matthias Hauer. In the 1960s, he also started to have a career as conductor and did so for decades. He also was a professor at the Music University in Vienna. His operas have been performed in prestigious places like the Salzburg Festival and the Vienna State Opera. The same goes for his orchestral works. So in a way, he represents the music history of the 20th century, somehow put into one person, especially for the Austrian music history. And I'm truly thankful that I was able to work with him and get to know him, as well as his amazing wife, Friedrich Cerha. There is a lot to learn about music in general by studying his pieces and listen to his opinions on music. So what you already know, I think it's clearly that an artist like Friedrich Cerha does not develop some sloppiness in music or retreats from work in spite of his advanced age. He is still composing every day. And he never copies himself. He still composes for not only orchestra, but also for small and even unusual ensembles. I've already pointed out that the diversity of Cerha's oeuvre is quite impressive, and so are the many different styles and genres he was composing in. Typical for a self-reflecting and constantly questioning composer, he works always reflecting the time of the creation of a piece, ranging from his early neoclassicist pieces through his reflection of the Second Viennese School to serialism to his large-scale compositions of postserialism, if you so want, or sound composition, which is a strange term he don't like actually, in the 60s, also to his stage works, his exploration of folklore and folk music from all over the world, and also Austrian folk music. He would always react to his environment, so his styles and interests changed over time. He remained a sensitive artist with open ears and eyes. In my class about the music of 1945, on Wednesday, I talked about Adorno a lot. I try to present the idea that an artist has to let subjectivity and his environment into the music in order to create a good piece of music. Cerha certainly did so. So it's also not surprising that Cerha himself is highly skeptical towards conventional stylistic categories and names where you can put him into. It's also equally difficult to attribute certain styles to his music. Often it would maybe fit for a few bars or few aspects of a piece, but also in general, he is hard to classify, which I actually like and appreciate a lot about his music. Despite his many styles, he does not reinvent his musical language for each of his pieces. That's not true. Whatever the inspiration for a new work is, his skills and his artistic freedom always allow him somehow to create new things without leaving the essential frame of his own musical style. That somehow seems hard to be done, but somehow it works. You will later see how, and you can also listen to it yourself when you compare the pieces. All his works belong to one artistic atmosphere where somehow the logic development is an essential criteria. Even if the detailed context between its elements only reveals itself if you listen very closely or have a look at the score, this logic development, which is also something important for him, which is also linked to an emotional understanding of his music, is in all his pieces. Even so, those pieces might sound very different from each other. All of those pieces somehow enable you to look into this Cerha universe of sound. Maybe it's his Cerha style of espressivo, or his instrumentation, or specific instrumental colors he often uses. Something is always there that sounds like Cerha. So even it's a very different genre, after a few minutes you might be able to recognize it's Cerha. By the way, he's also a painter and has quite a substantial oeuvre in paintings and ready-made works. And he also was a teacher for Georg Friedrich Haas, which you may know, one of the most well-known microtonal composers of our time. But here we focus on the music of Cerha himself, not on his teaching, not on his painting. Let's move on to my second chapter, the alternative serial tendencies and the post-serial strategies he developed. Cerha's serial period was brief and is today mainly interesting because of the post-serial strategies he developed out of them, or by referring to them. In his early serial pieces, he would continue the group idea of Stockhausen somehow, and would use serial strategies not for individual pitches or lines, but for groups or musical elements in a bigger scale. By doing so, he was more able to be flexible and free in shaping his own music. After the brief serial period, he started to write a very specific kind of new pieces. He wrote huge orchestra pieces with extensive divisi and huge orchestration. When they were written, there was actually no really a chance for them to be performed, so he somehow wrote them for the drawer to be performed in whatever future, he did not know. but he worked on notating and fixing his visions on score. One of the pieces somehow where he freed himself from everything conventional, or what he considered conventional at this time, as he would say, was Fascia from 1959. He already experimented in the pieces he wrote before Fascia in the mouvement with sound texture, so like the sound texture became the main material. So there he already stopped using the idea of melody or rhythm in a traditional way, or also the idea of using serial structures. But in Fascia then, he developed these ideas into a more complex, more rich, and process-oriented composition style. This is an important term that will reappear later, process. So it's not only about one texture here, followed by another one, but it's like a dramatic interaction and change between textures. There are several layers of development between them, and at the same time in layers. So the process as leading concept became an important idea for him in the 50s. For this piece, he also took inspiration from non-musical sources, like the works of the American scientist Norbert Wiener, the founder of cybernetics. The processes of Fascia then not only develop from A to B, they also interact with each other. They influence, hinder, stop, disturb, or exclude one another, like as if they are part of a higher level system that tries to balance itself somehow. It already refers somehow to nature, maybe, if you so want. So there are several lines or strains that are in this piece. There are, at the same time, several layers of continuous development, as I said before, but they are also in different speeds and in different situations. So they may take over each other or slow down, speed up. They move individually. The result was a new kind of richness and complexity on big and on small scale. So he even works out very, very small material, very, very detailed, as well as the bigger ones. So the complexity of the big material is resulting from the complexity of the small changes and small musical transformation that are happening. This is again somehow bring us a little bit back to what I just said before, the context of plants. His thinking in processes can for sure be compared to the growth of plants. I specifically talk in plural, so maybe you don't look at one plant, but you look at an area with many plants growing in different speeds and different sizes, maybe pushing each other away or grow over each other. The connection of nature science, or the observation of nature, and contemporary music is one of the most interesting things of the 20th and 21st century music. It can be very abstract or closely linked to scientific knowledge. So maybe you just take an idea, or you literally take data from scientific research and put into music. There are composers who would use models of growth and use this to develop musical ideas, and it actually also shapes the musical language for further pieces. Yannis Xenakis was one of the early ones. Composers who use this today, for example, are Alberto Posadas or Hector Parra, both of them very interestingly, use data and ideas of complex nature science to structure their pieces and to create new forms for their pieces. So for now, think of organic structures, plants, networks, while you hear me talk. The title Fascia actually means bind. It's also actually the word fascism derives from fascia in Italian. Here it refers to the idea that every musical event, every little thing that happens, every little figure or texture is always bound to a group event, and this group event is also bound to a bigger process, even so it might not immediately be obvious which process it's bound to. So a kind of relation from the smallest to the biggest, with similar structures just on different levels. They're all bound together, fascia. The individual group usually consists of notes close together of the same or related timbre or color. Those groups are having musical relationships with one another. That means that they are variations of each other, or that they at some point grow together, and then are part of a line in the piece that follows a development on a bigger scale. In the last part of the piece, for example, there are these developments of different tempo, but they begin and end at the same time in the piece. So during this part, they grow together. He uses glissandi to somehow explain to the listener what's going on. Also, the pitch space is compressed during this part. That means that the number of pitches or the number of intervals used is going smaller and smaller. This is one example for development, reducing the pitch material from lots of pitches or lots of interval spans to very small number of pitches or small intervals. Fascia then led him to his next step, composing the Spiegel Cycle. Spiegel, as I said before, is German for mirror. This is one of his major works. It was written and revised between the 1960s and 1972. It also took a very long time to be performed after it was written. With this piece, he entered something that was later described by musicologists as sound mass composition or sound composition, a term he actually don't like because he thinks that every composition somehow deals with sound, and actually he is interested in sound, but it was not his major concern. He just used sound to express certain ideas, or also certain emotional concepts he wanted to put in his music. Ligeti, Cerha, Xenakis, Penderecki would be composers who are approached with this title, sound mass composition. In my class of contemporary music on Wednesday, I drew a line from serialism to sound mass to spectralism to microtonal music, because I try to link all of them actually to a little core of serial ideas that would remain in all of those style and composition approaches. And as I also said before, serial ideas are actually present until today. Serialism is not gone completely. It's gone in a pure form, but ideas are still there. So in the 20th century, there are several strains that led to a bigger focus on sound itself. Of course, there was the French Impressionism with Debussy or Edgar Varese then later, but also serialism, as serialism brought in the category of sound and timbre as important as the category of pitch. So also serialism actually pays a lot of attention to sound and timbre. So somehow there is no missing link between Debussy and Boulez. It's almost at the beginning very systematically, but later very logical continuation. So we can also have the perspective and look at the sound mass compositions of Penderecki, Ligeti and Cerha and try to see serial strategies that are used there in order to be a tool to organize the many voices to become this huge moving body of sound. In music history, usually ideas based on serialism or opposing serialism are called post-serialistic ideas or strategies. So let's use this term to describe Cerha's music. So we often have huge orchestral scores that are basically only based on slow transformation of textures, or even they are just static sounds. The idea of chord progression, melody, rhythm, and so on was replaced by slow developments over many bars, or by small musical details within this development that push the bigger development. So sound becomes more and more important, as following the idea I said before, out of the serial idea, out of the French Impressionism. And all of this we see in Cerha's pieces. Those mass textures are also created by the usage of lots of extended techniques. So while there is lots of color created by a mass of instruments, the individual instruments often would use specific techniques to distort, widen or change timbre of the instrument, and so the all-over sound. So sound mass composition is also linked to new playing techniques, for example, Lachmann would use in chamber music or other orchestral pieces. Those famous sound mass composers I just mentioned, interestingly, all had similar ideas at the same time, but everyone came up with a bit different approach. So Ligeti, for example, would develop his pieces out of a micro-polyphony, a super dense counterpoint. Xenakis would use glissandi structures with different timing and tempi based on non-musical structures, like out of architecture, for example. Penderecki often would use cluster and also specific notation, which would include certain freedom for the musicians. Cerha, on the other hand, in his huge cycle, his 90-minute piece, basically using all the things I described before. Nevertheless, as compared to, for example, Ligeti, his music would always have more or less a process going somewhere, even so there are some little parts that are a little bit static in their texture, in their sound. In general, it always moves somewhere. So he combines all the structures, all the methods Penderecki would use, Ligeti would use, or Xenakis would use. And also the idea of relate to non-musical ideas. He has something in common with Xenakis. Interestingly also, Cerha, Penderecki and Xenakis would refer to the war as one of the inspirations to compose such sound mass pieces. I will now try to point out the major characteristics of this piece, Spiegel. So the Spiegel is a massive cycle of 7 pieces following different structures. It's about 90 minutes. Most of those structures are actually based on the idea of mirrors or mirror structures on big and small level. So there are references to parts at the beginning, which would reappear at the ending, and in the center there is, for example, a climax would also be shaped in a mirror form. Mirror somehow is the basic construction principle. There is a constant flow and development that leads somewhere else all the time, except for the little static moments I mentioned before. In some parts, there is even a pre-recorded tape. It is just part of the orchestra, just like one instrument. It's not even specifically powerful compared to the orchestra. It's one instrument out of 120 or so. The orchestra usually always acts as a homogeneous body, so there's almost never a solo or something like this. Usually always the orchestra as one instrument plays the music. Some parts, for example, follow an impulse. This is a very simple linear process. So an impulse is given, and then an event is created, or is an event, and everything, very close proximity to this first event, so in time, is tightly linked to this impulse. And then the impulse fades out, and we further go away from this initial impulse. So the further we go away from the beginning of something, the more the material changes and is less related to the initial material. There are also feedback processes, for example. Many things that are all linked to this mirror structure, this overall mirror structure. He is also using micro-intervals. He would use a continuous curve to shape the pitches, for example. So they do not necessarily are within the 12-tone chromatic scale. Often they're quarter tones or even smaller. So lines can change tempi. They can slow down, overtake one another, and so on, like in the traffic on a big road. But despite the massive amount of sounds in Spiegel and also all the movements, there's actually not so much musical material in a classical way. There's a tight web of musical ideas and textures that have much attention in the composition process. But the material itself is not so much. This is very surprising if you listen to the piece and hear all the sound and music. Cerha is interested in plants and how they grow. So natural development of material in general is something he's very interested in. And also that a plant, of course, has fine structures everywhere. Just because it's big does not mean that in detail it's not still fine and has all the little details. So he himself often refers actually to plants and how they grow. So I have this from him himself. And I think something for our ears in the year 2020. I think it's very interesting to hear his music now in the context of noise music and many contemporary music which would use ideas of this but recreate with electronic technology. So the idea of noise and sound mass is still alive, but less in orchestra than actually in electronic music or live electronic music. Also interestingly is that he himself refers to the intention of creating an emotional musical piece in this piece. It's not abstract head music as some people would criticize it. It's actually a piece that follows emotional, dramatic moments. And this leads me to my also very interesting last point, that this piece was also intended to be a form of music theater. Yes, music theater. So his idea was that this piece could be like a world theater, as if the audience, we would look from far away onto the humans and see their behavior, their mass movements, their evolution, their change, their processes. But it was never performed like this yet. I hope it will be done someday. After this huge sound mass, huge orchestra pieces, Cerha would actually go back to more clear lines and to more counterpoint-like structures, reduced sound, and again, more musical material. And yeah, he would also start to compose small chamber music again. So this was a period in the 60s and 70s that was all over Europe very, very common, that composers tend to use huge dimensions in their pieces, and Cerha was a leading part of this. I now deliberately jump to the next chapter, the unexpected material, I called it in the beginning. And also, I said in the introduction, he has many styles. So before we continue to talk, listen to this next piece. This was one song out of his cycle Eine Art Chansons, a type of chanson, from the 1980s, in which he uses poems of Viennese experimental poets. In the introduction, he said he also was, I said he also was acquainted with experimental artists in Vienna in the 1950s and 1960s. Among them also, of course, were poets. And they had a club where they would meet, where they would gather, discuss, and also perform pieces together with performance art, which was created in those time, and painters and other artists. They also would work on new forms of how to use language in music and poetry, from mimicking sounds and word games to music-like structures in poems. And they would also start to include dialect and local language in their poems. And there were also connections to Dada, for example, and there are also lots of satirical or ironic references to their society and to their environment, all within those texts they wrote. Actually, much later in the 80s, then Cerha took on those early impressions he had with this text and started to working on them. But he clearly decided to not go into a typical art song tradition like the Schubert or Strauss tradition, or then later also the, for example, Riem tradition. He wanted to go into a more playful chanson-like world, where he nevertheless was able to catch the idea of the text. So he chose chanson. Chanson would be a song format which is quite direct. It's less artificial than an art song. It also uses speaking sometimes. It combines this with more extreme elements also, like exaggerating elements of too much of something. The singer has to scream sometimes, sing or speak, but usually everything is a little bit more laid back than in an art song. As I said in the beginning, it's more playful. He also would work in this format to bring the words of the poets into an even more absurd environment, if they would be presented in a bar almost or so. And this he also used to sometimes amplify the banalities in them. So humor is a great motor or motivation for composing all of those pieces. Humor in all of its shades, dark humor to more light humor. In general, the way he creates humor is a combination of extremes, quick changes in musical parameters, references like mimicking something or someone put into wrong contrast, for example. With wrong contrast, I mean maybe something opposite is combined with it. So maybe that something in the text and in the music says something completely different. Literature in general was actually a very important source for Cerha and his pieces. There are several pieces also based on texts by Thomas Bernhard, for example. One of his most famous books, Gehen, or Walking actually, was used by Cerha for a piece. In all of the songs of this chanson cycle, he always also tried to reflect his other musical experiences. And this is what I meant in the introduction. I tried to explain more vaguely and open that even so a sound mass composition for huge orchestra lasting many, many bars has in some way similarities to his small 3-minute songs. I cannot do a full analysis here to clear up these connections, but there are many. So, for example, that there are in small dimensions developments, that there are also sound textures, like with the mallards he use a lot. This is something you would hear in the big pieces as well as in the small pieces. As this development I just said is like, of course, there can also be a development in 3 minutes. There can be in a bigger dimension in structure be similar to a 20-minute process, like something is growing. Something goes from high interval jumps to small interval jumps, for example. Or something goes from low to high. This can be spread over many bars or in just a few bars. But of course, the context of this structural or developments or of these instrumental colors changes. In an orchestra piece, it's a completely different context than in a 3-minute song. Nevertheless, they are linked somehow. And of course, there are lots of moments in those songs that remind us of his actually very tragic and often very dramatic operas. And this is also something typical. So in the songs, there are some dramatic scenes, basically, again, condensed to just a few bars, which in opera would be a huge scene. But this idea of condensing something into a few bars and just a few pitches is something very typical for the second Viennese school. That's typical Webern. Like it would be Webern, the condensed, squeezed version of Mahler. In this particular case, it's also important to see these songs in context of their cycle, so put into a bigger structure. There is a fixed order. So with developing dramatic climaxes and shifting in meaning and character over the whole cycle. In the middle of the cycle, for example, is the climax towards a very, very serious song. Then after this, he falls back into more dialect language and more funny elements again. They then form almost a comment on this very serious piece in the middle, which had a political statement related to the time it was composed. And of course, there is one piece which somehow always pops up in your mind if you listen to this. It's Schönberg's Pierrot Lunaire, a piece Cerha knew very well. The idea of this mixture between singing and speaking, so I mean, basically you jump to the notated pitch, but then you don't remain there, but you immediately fall back to a speaking tone and don't hold the pitch. Sprechgesang, it's called in German. So this also will lead, of course, to a different approach on vibrato, on crescendo, and all of the singing techniques. You would not color your vowels in the same way of Sprechgesang and normal singing. All of this he had in mind composing this, creating this very specific chanson-like way of presenting these pieces. These pieces also seek for a specific Viennese tone, and he tries to integrate folk music elements in combination with sometimes the dialect of the words already. Also, this is actually a reference to Arnold Schönberg. He also uses this in the background of Pierrot Lunaire, and he also composed folk songs himself. I also have in mind the famous folk song quote of O du lieber Augustin in his second string quartet, which was a major work of early atonality. So this link of Schönberg is part of Cerha, and this is also something that you may use to link it to other pieces. So the heritage of the second Viennese school is in Cerha, in all of Cerha somehow. There's another interesting part in Cerha's life, which is not so widely recognized. It's his interest in not classical traditional music. I don't like to say so much like non-European music, because there's also European music that is actually very far away from the traditional canon. So the idea of alternatives to variation and polyphony, also of alternatives to the well-tempered system, he not only found in post-serial strategies, he also found in music outside of the Central European canon. We can also put into this foreign material almost a little bit his work on Viennese folk songs we just encountered in the chansons. But Cerha did not only remain in Central Europe, he also went out abroad in search for new impulses. Like his famous student Georg Friedrich Haas, also Cerha studied the music of Alois Haber, which used microtunes extensively. The interest for non-classical derived European music and the ideas of microtones we can hear combined in his first string quartet, for example. The non-classical in this case is also non-European. It is inspired by Arabic music, especially from his impressions in Morocco. We just heard the first slow part, and this first slow part, with its melodic material and the viola, is some sort of basic material, and he will use this material to create the following 10 segments, using all kinds of variation procedures. The length proportions of the viola melody pitches will become the rhythmic material for those later variations, also the proportion of the segments to each other then later. Listen to the microtones and how he uses them in the melodic material and how it enriches and immediately changes the color and harmony once they are used. Also, please think of how close it actually sounds to late works of Mahler. Just think of the 10th Symphony. Again, a connection to the Second Viennese School and its connection to Mahler. The links to the Second Viennese School are present in all the parts actually. I would even dare to say in most of the works of Cerha. Maybe he would disagree, but I somehow can sense them almost everywhere. In this case, they are more close to Schönberg and Berg than to Webern. Try to figure out this connection in combination with non-European sounding melodic and rhythmic figures. I think it's very interesting to have in mind this Second Viennese School link with non-European traditions. It can somehow merge to a very, very interesting musical world. I now want to go on to another maybe unexpected material from a composer like Friedrich Cerha. I want to go on to radio plays. Until today, radio plays are almost like a safe haven for avant-gardistic sound ideas. Since the early time, this was a medium where experiments had their space and have been appreciated by audiences. It can almost be like a test area for composers and writers. Here, things can be done that may not yet be possible for a stage or concert hall. While today, they are often limited to small ensemble recordings and often just soloists, in the 60s, radio plays also have been done with orchestras and choirs. The Austrian radio commissioned Cerha with such a large-scale radio piece, specifically composed to be played in radio. The title of the piece is Und du. That means and you. Please also have in mind that the European radio stations played a major role in the support and establishing of contemporary music as it is today in Europe. They would play contemporary music on radio, they have festivals where new music is premiered, like Witten or Donaueschingen, and they have orchestras which would play contemporary pieces and give commissions. This is still the case until now. Without this structure, the European music scene would not be as rich and interesting as it is today. So for this piece, Cerha would use his newly created sound world, which I have introduced last week with the piece Fascia and the following Spiegel pieces, and combine it with tapes, speakers, chamber music like soloist elements, choir, and technical alterations like mixing or modulations. The spoken language itself was also integrated into the score, even so sometimes rather free. And sometimes the music almost swallows the voices. It's a long piece, almost 40 minutes. And by swallowing the voices, the music sometimes already take over almost a little bit the message or the meaning of the text. The piece is about the horror of nuclear war. Let's move on to the next chapter, Cerha's music theater world. In the first lecture, I talked about his Spiegel Cycle, the 7 pieces for huge orchestra that are inspired by cybernetics and processes, developments, and their interaction with each other. Also inspired by cybernetics and the same principles is his music theater piece Netzwerk, means network. The term cybernetics can be explained by Cerha himself. In an interview, Cerha gave an example. So there was a park and there was a stripe, a band of green plants next to the street. People unfortunately did not go around this green area and enter the park as intended from the architects, but they just crossed this green area on one specific spot. So there was dirt instead of flowers. The city tried to stop them with signs, but people kept crossing on this spot. So after a while, the city adapted and made a real way through the green so people can use it and not destroy the green and the plants. But then the symmetry of the park area was somehow destroyed by it. So On the other side, there was basically the same situation. They made a second crossing, a second way, so they balance this ensemble again there. The balance would be restored. But the second crossing, people completely ignored and did not use it. This little, very simple example can explain how systems interact with each other, how systems communicate with each other. This can be seen as a simplified view on cybernetics and what Friedrich Cerha found so interesting in them. This thinking, cybernetic thinking, is inspired by Heinz von Förster and Norbert Wiener. Based on their ideas, Cerha found a way away from serialism to his mass structures we talked about last time. They also inspired him to adapt this mass music into a music theater world, and that's the point of this lecture today. A form of world music theater. Remember in the first lecture I said that the Spiegel Cycle can be seen as a form of theater about mankind, seen from far away. So their movements, their development. It is a theater about society structures, about evolution, about networks. Again, processes that influence each other, creating complex structures. It's about the creation of systems and how they work or how they fail. It's a little bit as if you would look at ants or bees creating their societies and building their structures. So this idea remained and led Cerha to his music theater piece Netzwerk I mentioned before, which was completed in the 1980s. In this piece there are several levels of zoom, if you want. So there are parts where it is about a huge processes from far away, but there are also parts where decisions or movements of individual people are portrayed, so a small dimension. This small dimension, Cerha calls them regress or regress, is like fall back or go back. They are like disturbances of the big structure, and their sound material is very much different from the big structures, like as if they are thrown into the piece. During the piece, those dimensions get more and more mixed up, almost like a metaphor how we exist or struggle in a complex society between individual events and mass events. Another interesting aspect in the music theater is that the singers and speakers don't speak a language that exists. They basically speak a language only created by Cerha. So this language does not have a meaning in its combinations of vowels and consonants we are used to. But somehow there is always a kind of meaning as soon as you make sounds with your voice. But in the context of the music theater, it becomes somehow the carrier of dramatic moments. So it somehow carries a form of meaning. It sometimes sounds like Russian or German, but it's not. So it also creates associations, references to something that remains unclear. So you think you hear a German or Russian word, but you're not sure which one, or if you hear correctly. This is actually an approach several composers in Europe used in the 20th and 21st century and are using until now actually. A famous one who would use this a lot is Georges Apergis, French composer. Another important opera of Friedrich Cerha is Baal, based on the play by Bertolt Brecht of the same name. Cerha himself often felt as an outsider, so many of his characters in the operas are also outsiders, often outsiders who fail and crack in their role and suffer a dramatic ending actually. The same goes for Baal. I quickly sum up the plot. So Baal is a poet, he always drunk, he's very aggressive, he's an anti-hero who does not want to follow the rules of society. He seduces Johanna, who then later drowns herself. Then he spurns his pregnant mistress, Sophia, and abandons her. He murders his friend Eckhart, then becomes a fugitive from the police. Actually, at the end, he suffers and dies alone in a forest, on the run from society and the consequences. His dreams and visions of a world he would like don't come true. The music of Baal uses all kinds of material, also Spiegel-like structures, but also again material that remind us of Berg. There is melodic material and mass structure next to each other. But we can see something similar than in Netzwerk. The individual only get into the focus of the opera to provoke, to disturb the processes and developments around him. This is how Baal is an outsider. He's not part of the society, he don't even mix with them, he always confronts them. The opera asks the question how an individual person has to act in the big system, in the big processes. Nevertheless, In general, Baal is much more a traditional opera than Netzwerk. It follows a clear narrative. It has roles, it has arias, it has ensemble scenes, and so on. And there are words, and the understanding of the words are now much more important for Cerha. All the operas since Baal then follow such a structure and can be called almost traditional literature-based operas. But all his works still center around the problematic relationship of individuals and the society, their relationship to the society, basically. A little bit like in a concerto also, the soloist against or with the orchestra. Also something that all his operas have in common is the organic composition process. So the way he composes counterpoint lines, for example, and how the material grows out of small seeds and out of serial structuring principles, actually. In the music of Baal, there are three layers, representing what I said before with the mass structures. So one layer is for the individuals. Here are melodies very dominant. Then, the music of the society, a second layer, is characterized by repetitions and very cliché phrases, almost by banal music, by simple music. Then, the third layer are very tightly set textures, and they usually represent, for example, the nature or some specific ideas. In those layers, Cerha uses lots of traditional music forms. There's fugue, there's dances, a passacaglia, and so on. For his other operas, Cerha found other individual approaches on how to create the form, so this is not completely typical for the other operas. But in all of them, there is a clear dramaturgy that supports the listener and also enables Cerha to work on a semantical level within his own works. I mean this on a bigger scale, so meaning he can use the music to tell the story parallel to the words on a bigger level. Bigger level, I mean not just within a scene or within a phrase. This concept can help him to shape whole parts of an opera. So this Baal is destroying his environment because he won't accept the rules. In this, there may be some parallels to Alban Berg's Lulu, which Cerha completed. But already Bertolt Brecht, the author of Baal, has some references to Lulu in her original text. In those moments, also Cerha makes references to the music of Berg. That's why I said sometimes the music sounds like Berg. And another thing is, if Baal has moments of irrationality, of dreams, of ideas, of visions, looking into something that he wants to have in an ideal way, the sound textures we know from the Spiegel Cycle reappear. So there are often long dance textures and Baal just speaks over them. This is like the scenes where Baal would have a visionary idea or thinks of a visionary world. While there is another more banal music, a more simple music, which would be the music of society, and they are in contrast to each other. In an interview, Cerha once mentioned that the Baal opera is almost some sort of summary of his experiences in his life. The complex relationship to the music of his time, the search for ways out of serialism, the second Viennese school tradition, and also the post-war society and his war traumata created enough friction Cerha was putting into music here. And also please have in mind that all the stuff I told you about Friedrich Cerha was not just easily done. The society of the 1950s and 60s had some avant-gardists, some very open people, but also lots of very narrow-minded people. So Cerha has a long history of fight, and a fight that also might be sometimes very frustrating. For the end of this lecture, I also want you to listen a little bit to a percussion concerto Cerha wrote for the percussion star Martin Grubinger. He specifically wrote this for his skills, but still, it very much remains Cerha. When you listen to all the examples I've given you, you maybe still already understand what I mean. So now try to listen to this very explosive piece and try to find his style within this material.